we're picking up in Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity with these portraits of bad faith actors that she begins to paint in the second chapter. And I think that this is some of the most compelling material in the second chapter generally, but these types that she's devising, I think, are really interesting and give us a lot of food for thought. So today we'll talk mostly about, I think, submen or underlings, which is, I think, my preferred term, and the serious man or serious people. Leading up to this section, Beauvoir had talked about the need of this sort of self-transcendence, that a lot of times people aren't quite satisfied with just sort of sitting on their laurels, that they want to push beyond. Her example is the artist who is always trying to push and improve and develop and kind of overcome where they are now. And it takes a kind of comfort in your incompleteness and in your failure, as Beauvoir has been talking about that term, to do that. You have to be kind of okay with the fact that you haven't, to want to keep, pushing and developing and to all that kind of stuff. You have to be okay with the dissatisfaction that sometimes comes along with life and our achievements, that, well, okay, that was, could have done this or that, let me try, again, or do something else, or, keep working on that to become better or something, right? And again, it can be very difficult to reconcile yourself with a past that has now become sort of an objective fact of the world. This anxiety in the face of our freedom, the anguish that we feel, that's the term that appears in Being and Nothingness, in our freedom, leads many, many people, and all of us, to some extent, to participate in bad faith. I have a separate video that just explains the concept of bad faith, so I'll link to that in the details of this video below, and you can get the idea of bad faith fleshed out a little bit better. Just here briefly, I'll say the idea of bad faith is a lie that we tell to ourselves. So we attempt to conceal from ourselves the fact of our own freedom by playing between our being in itself and being for itself. So we want to reduce ourselves to an object to a certain extent in order to deny our freedom, but we also want to admit our freedom, like, just enough so that we can enjoy the moment, or that we can enjoy certain things, or can perform a certain role or something like that, right? So it's very tricky. I think Beauvoir's analysis actually goes a little bit beyond the kind of basic bad faith that Sartre talks about in Being and Nothingness. She's got a very robust analysis throughout these next many pages in the Ethics of Ambiguity. So I'll talk more about that as we proceed. But if you want to hear more detail about bad faith, check out that other video that I've linked to. The first type of person that she discusses here is this sub-man. She says, if we were to try to establish a kind of hierarchy among men, we would put those who are denuded of this living warmth, the tepidity which the gospel speaks of, on the lowest rung of the ladder. To exist is to make oneself a lack of being. It is to cast oneself into the world. Those who occupy themselves in restraining this original movement can be considered as sub-men. They have eyes and ears, but from their childhood on they make themselves blind and deaf, without love and without desire. This apathy manifests a fundamental fear in the face of existence, in the face of the risks and the tensions that it implies. The subman rejects this passion which is the human condition, the laceration and the failure of that drive toward being which always misses its goal, but which thereby is the very existence which he rejects. So let me just speak for just a second on why submen here. So they're existing, to be human is to be free. But this person wants to sort of fly below the level of their freedom. They want to keep it at bay and not own that passion that commits them and throws them into the world, right? So they're sort of below the level of their humanity. They're not rising up to the level of humanity that their freedom sort of demands of them or places upon them, right? They're in denial about it. There's also a play on Nietzsche here. Nietzsche has this idea of the Obermensch, the overman, who is overcoming themselves and establishing and creating values. So the Obermensch recognizes their power to generate values in the world, right? The subman here denies that power in themselves. They, on the one hand, sort of recognize it, but they want to flee from it. They, rather than take it up, they don't want it. So there's a play there, the subman versus the Oberman, playing on this concept from Nietzsche, where the Obermensch recognizes themselves as the source of value and leans into that, whereas the subman here in Beauvoir flees that power that they have, that ability of generating values that is inherent in their very action. One of the reasons I don't love the subman title just because of its dehumanizing undertones. I think that we've had quite enough of that kind of rhetoric throughout the 20th century. I sort of like underling because underling captures also the connotations that she develops later. So if you look, the subman or the underling will flit from thing to thing. He would prefer to be a brute, right? Where that he just accepts things. He'll proclaim certain opinions. He'll take shelter behind a label, and to hide his indifference, he will readily abandon himself to verbal outbursts or even physical violence. One day a monarchist, the next day an anarchist. He is more readily anti-Semitic, anti-clerical, or anti-Republican. So he's often against things. He can flip-flop back between sort of with the push and pull of popular opinion or something like that. And then in lynchings, in pogroms, and in all the great bloody movements organized by the fanaticism of seriousness and passion, movements where there is no risk, those who do the actual dirty work are recruited from among the submen. And that's one of the reasons why I think underling is really interesting. Because to be an underling, to be a follower, to go along with the flow. And notice there that she says, in these movements which are without risk for the person involved. If you're becoming involved in a lynching or a pogrom, or you're committing yourself or allowing yourself to be taken up by an oppressive regime, usually the risk is not to you. Even poor white people in the South who are participating in lynchings, they're not getting lynched. The risk is not to them. They can, without risk, engage in this mob and vent their anger and feel empowered and then go home. They're not the one hanging from the tree, so to speak. There's not a risk to them. And that's one of the things that makes the movement appealing, is that it offers them sort of a place that they don't have to create for themselves while sheltering them from the risk of the choices that they might have to make otherwise, right? Now, the leaders are serious people. She brings this up a couple of pages later. The serious man gets rid of his freedom by claiming to subordinate it to values which would be unconditioned. He imagines the accession of these values likewise permanently confers upon himself. Shielded with rights, he fulfills himself as a being who escapes from the stress of existence. The serious is not defined by the nature of the ends he pursues. A frivolous lady of fashion can have this mentality of the serious as well as an engineer. There is the serious from the moment that freedom denies itself to the advantage of ends which one claims are absolute. So rather than having to generate our own ends and justify ourselves, we project that into the world and say, well, I'm doing it because there's this absolute value. And again, she returns to this discussion of childhood to say it's very compelling to offer people an alternative to having to choose for themselves. And when a serious person commits themselves to this absolute value, it can become like an all-defining thing. That this idea to which they've committed themselves drives them because they feel as though they've committed themselves to like a fact of the world, that it's compelling them. And serious people can be all over the place, right? She says a person can commit themselves to fashion just as much as they could to a political cause or something like that. The key of the serious is not the content that they've committed themselves to. It's not the specific thing that they're taking seriously. It's the fact that they take something, whatever it is, serious in the sense that they think that it's an absolute value beyond human action and the human condition. Now, of course, we're sort of fooling ourselves, right? On the one hand, because we still have to choose the cause. We still have to look out there and see what our options are and pick one and not the other ones. Picking to be a Christian is to not be a Buddhist or not be Jewish or not be whatever, right? And so we still have made a choice that we then try to disavow our responsibility for. Well, I chose this because I really have no choice, because it's just a fact of the world. And that dishonesty, right? The serious man's dishonesty issues from his being obliged ceaselessly to renew the denial of his freedom. He chooses to live in an infantile world, but to the child the values are really given by parents, by school, by the situation into which they're placed without their control. The serious man must mask the movement by which he gives them to himself, like the mythomaniac who, while reading a love letter, pretends to forget that she has sent it to herself. We have already pointed out that certain adults can live in the universe of the serious in all honesty. For example, those who are denied all instruments of escape, those who are enslaved or who are mystified. So there again, she's referring back to her analysis that I pointed out as being somewhat problematic there. Though, if I'm being sort of generous with Beauvoir, I think that there is something to the idea that there can be situations in which our material conditions are so dire and which we're so confined by the powers of others that resignation comes about a little honestly. Like, we make a decision, well, it's this or I die. I mean, they're going to kill me if I try otherwise. Still, though, that infantilizing language, I think, throws us back into some problems that could be avoided under a different analysis, right? Under a different understanding of the continuation of childhood. But you can just watch the last video on the Ethics of Ambiguity, and I'll talk about that. I'll point into some directions there. Beauvoir does make another interesting point about this, where you begin to see the possibility beyond the confines. They can, in their situation of ignorant and powerless individuals, know the truth of existence and raise themselves to a properly moral life. It even happens that they turn the freedom which they have thus won against the very object of their respect. So you can rebel against the master, so to speak. And there, some of the books, like I'm thinking here particularly of like Richard Wright in a book like Black Boy or Native Son, will talk about a lot of the ways in which an oppressed person attempts to turn the tables on their master from a position of relative powerlessness. So they display a kind of they exercise their power in the way that they can, and in oftentimes sort of unexpected ways, and sometimes in ways that actually are not all that helpful, because they might be doing it out of spite or something like that. So there's a whole range of ways in which people can effectively or ineffectively sort of buck the system. But there are techniques and behaviors that people use to try to turn their powerlessness into a power. I'm going to stop this particular video there. So we have two of these profiles on the table, the subman or underling and the serious one. I'm going to pick up the next video, say just a little bit more about seriousness, and then we'll move into the next phase, and we'll spend a little bit of time there talking about nihilism. So we'll see that these different attitudes are capable of transformations into one or the other. So it's not as if they're fixed types that a person is, right? Remember, with existentialism, you're not a thing. You're not going to remain one being that you will coincide with for all time. So these are not fixed like archetypes or something like that. It's possible to transform from sort of one type into another type, depending upon how you're relating to your freedom and how you're orienting yourself in the world and in your situation toward your ends and the projects of other people and so on. So I'll say just a little bit more in the next video about seriousness, and then we'll talk some about nihilism. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.